Sorry about that short podcast. In other parts of the South, there were, like Louisiana, it became illegal to hunt and fish. The idea being that if you were African American and you could hunt and fish, you could take care of yourself, you could feed your family. And the idea is that African Americans are put in a situation where they can't take care of themselves, they can't feed their families, that they're forced to go and work for whites in order to have any kind of living at all. They're very, very insidious, and they're all over the South, including Texas, black codes. So you'll see that actually on a midterm question, I'm quite sure. Ultimately, though, white Southerners, they overdo it. They overdo it. It's pretty clear that they're trying to create this legal system that in some ways mimics slavery. What also happens in 1866, you have a massacre of ex-slaves who met in New Orleans, and they're trying to gain the right to vote. And they have a meeting, and they're surrounded by a white mob, and they come out, African Americans and some of their white allies. They come out of this meeting and they're shot down in cold blood. They're murdered in cold blood. They came out waving white flags, and they're just mowed down just for trying to get the right to vote. You have a massacre of African Americans in Nashville as well. So finally, whites in the North, who actually hadn't really cared much about the post-war experience of slaves. They thought, haven't we done enough? We fought this war, we ended slavery. They start to ask a question: what was the Civil War about? Whites, Confederates, who we fought, are still in power. They're creating systems of laws that are mimicking slavery, and they're massacring African Americans who were just trying to get the right to vote. And so, I would say, just for the purposes of this class, by 1867, 1868, you have a reaction against the regaining of power by white Confederates. So I know I'm not being very clear, so let me try to be clear. So here's the sequence of events. And one of the things is it's just really confusing. I think folks often think history goes in one way, but this is Reconstruction, it zigzags, let me put it like that. So after the Civil War, whites, even white Confederates, keep power in the South. And you actually have Confederate generals and Confederate politicians elected to office in the South. Okay, so in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, defeated Confederate whites keep power in states, the states of the South that had left the Union. They try to create the system of black codes. They try to suppress African American political involvement. They try to control the labor of African Americans. There's two very well publicized massacres of African Americans in New Orleans and in Nashville. The white North is horrified by what's going on in the South. So what happens is that Washington steps in by 1867, and it takes control over the Reconstruction process. Republicans in Washington, D.C. felt like Andrew Johnson had been too friendly to white Southerners, that white Southerners were basically just thumbing their nose in the face of the part of the United States that had defeated them. So Congress comes in, and it takes over the Reconstruction process. And there's several aspects to this story. One of them is that the U.S. Army comes into the South and occupies the South. There's so much violence against African Americans, and there's so much opposition to their voting, that Washington decides that, the Congress decides in Washington that African Americans will only gain the right to vote if you have elements of the U.S. Army in the South that are there protecting blacks and making sure that they won't be victims of white violence. The other thing that happens is that, if you can see it on your little screen that you're watching this, the power is taken away from civilians in the South in 1867. And the South becomes 5 military districts, and a military commander comes in, and for a brief period of time is the ultimate authority in states like Texas. So believe it or not, in beginning around the late 1868, 1869, 1870, the governor is not the main authority in Texas. It's a military commander. The U.S. government has to occupy its own states in the post-Civil War period because it's so chaotic. African Americans are being harassed so violently, and Southern whites who had been defeated are so recalcitrant that the elements of the army, not a huge number, but you would have Union Army or U.S. Army in San Antonio. You would see these folks. They come in and they basically serve as a police force for a brief period of time in the South. And so Texas becomes District 5. Texas and Louisiana are unified into one district. So long story short, by 1868, Texas is under, for a very, very brief period of time, military occupation under a military governor. And what happens during this period is that African Americans gain the right to vote. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution, and then later the 15th Amendment of the Constitution, guaranteed that African Americans were citizens and that they had the right to vote. And this is the period where you see folks like Matthew Gaines access political power for at least a short period of time. After the North is kind of horrified by the behavior of Southern whites in the immediate post-Civil War period, there's a reaction to that. And so about 3 years after the end of the war, Washington comes in, takes over the South, sends in army troops into the South, and registers African American males under the protection of the United States Army. And it's during this period that African American males gain the right to vote. It doesn't happen right after the Civil War. It happens about 3 years later as part of the Northern backlash against the behavior of Southern whites in the post-Civil War period. And once African Americans gain the right to vote, they take full advantage of it. African American leaders would step up and vote. African Americans males were quite thrilled that they had to vote. They had been fighting for this ever since the war ended. And you have black leaders elected as delegates to the state legislature. Never in the proportion. Texas at this point, about 1 out of 3 Texans was African American. Blacks never went into the state legislature in proportion to their numbers, but you did see African Americans in the state legislature, which is truly revolutionary given that 4 years before, most of these men had been slaves. I mean, this is pretty insane. This is crazy in the best possible sense of crazy, right? And then African Americans, they come in, they write a new state constitution. This constitution provides for the first time that education is financed through various forms of taxation throughout the state. African American political leaders, their highest priority was always education because they had not been allowed to read or write during the times of slavery. And so what you had was the financing of a statewide public school system, which is the first time you'd had a statewide financing of a public school system. Ultimately, you have 14 members, African Americans, in the Texas legislature. As I talked about, Matthew Gaines, he pushes through a bill, the result of which is the creation of Texas A&M University, and Prairie View A&M University. And so for a brief period of time, African Americans have a real voice in Texas. It doesn't last long. The reason for this is that most white Texans were horrified and humiliated by the fact that African Americans, number one, had gained the right to vote. Remember, this is what they'd always been afraid of. And number two, are serving in the state legislature. So what you start to see by the late 1860s into the early 1870s is pervasive violence against African Americans and their white allies, not only in Texas, but throughout the South. The Democratic Party in the South is the party of whites during this period, and it basically has an armed wing. And organizations, say like the Ku Klux Klan, there were many white terror organizations during this period. The KKK is the most famous, but there were many other white vigilante, white terrorist group, and they were terrorists. They would go, they would kidnap black leaders, they would kill them, they would whip them, they would burn down their churches, they would intimidate African Americans that were voting. They would say, if you're going to vote, we'll kill you, we'll burn down your church, we'll burn down your house. So, long story short, through intimidation, what happens is, by the middle of the 1870s, the U.S. Army has pulled out of Texas. Whites in the North got tired of having an army in places like Texas in the South. It didn't sit right with them that the U.S. Army was occupying parts of the United States. So whites who had been upset about the treatment of ex-slaves in the 1867, 1868 period, by the middle of the 1870s, they're saying to these folks, look, we've done everything for you we're going to do. We freed you. We sent in the U.S. Army. We gave you the right to vote. We protected you while you registered to vote. We protected you when you voted. Now we're taking off. Good luck. The problem is that when the U.S. Army pulled out of the South, basically the African American community had very, very little protection against the pervasive white terror that was facing them, that was designed to make them powerless. So by the middle of the 1870s, Anglo-Texans, white Texans, had come in. They had taken over the Texas legislature again. Yet another constitution is written, which is very much a constitution that's friendly to white folks. African Americans don't immediately lose power, but they lose power over time. I would say by 1900, a very, very small percentage of African Americans are voting in Texas.